Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Good. Welcome to our inaugural Lori S. Bauer Foundation for Sudden Loss Conference on Help, Healing, and Hope After Loss. I am Elizabeth Siegel-Cohen, Outreach and Bereavement Specialist with the Jewish Healing Network of Chicago. We provide resources, support, and education on issues of illness, addiction, and loss. Jewish Healing Network is a collaborative program between Jewish Child and Family Services, CJE Senior Life, the Chicago Board of Rabbis, and the Jewish Federation. We are gathered this evening as mourners, as friends, as clergy, and professional caregivers to find help, healing, and hope after loss. This evening would not be possible without the generous support of the Lori S. Bauer Foundation for Sudden Loss. I would now like to introduce Scott Bauer, the founder of the foundation, to speak about the vital work of this foundation and our new partnership. Scott?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I may get to this over the next few minutes, but thank you all for coming tonight. Obviously, this is a much-needed, let's call it seminar, workshop, conference, whatever you want to call it. There's not a lot of this that really exists out there to help people in the community. And when my wife passed away almost 2 years ago now, the outpouring from friends, family members, community members was just unreal, absolutely unreal. And shortly after she passed, we made the decision that you can go one way, you can go the other way. And we made the decision to try and make some lemonade out of lemons. And we formed this foundation that we had absolutely no idea where it was going or what it was going to do. But we knew we wanted to help people. We wanted to help children who have lost parents, who have lost siblings, and we wanted to help community members that really had nowhere to turn. So in just a short year, what our foundation has done is we've opened up a children's grief center in Deerfield in partnership with the Bar Harris organization, where just since last November, we've already seen over 50 different patients, accounting for almost 400 therapy sessions. So that's just in 1 year we've done that. We are planning to open up another center in Evanston in the next few months because the need for it is there. The need for grief counseling, for therapy, especially for children, is out there. And who would have ever thought about it until you come face to face with the unfortunate situation? I mean, I see it with my own kids. I have 3 boys, and I see what they need and what they're going through, and just when we were searching for help, there wasn't anything out there. So besides setting up the children's grief centers, we also have a school outreach program in partnership with a wonderful organization called Willow House, where licensed therapists go into the school setting and they host workshops like this, seminars for staff, for teachers, for administrators, for people on the front line, because quite frankly, those people don't know how to deal with children's grief. They're not taught how to deal with children's grief, and that's something in the school setting that people actually shun and kind of shy away from. So again, just in the past year since the foundation has been in existence, we have reached out to almost 40,000 students in the Chicago area just with these seminars and these workshops. Recently now, with this great partnership that we have that's starting tonight, we will be hosting these types of seminars, these types of workshops. This afternoon there was one for the professional community, for therapists, psychologists, clergy members that Dr. Noka was in charge of as well, and I know that was very well attended, and tonight is open for the community, for all of us who have been touched by some unfortunate tragedy and maybe don't have anywhere else to turn. In addition, starting right after the new year in partnership as well, we are going to be getting going to be starting grief counseling groups for 55 and younger. Because, quite frankly, I mean, I'm in that category, and I hope to be for a while, but, you know, when I lost my wife, there's not a lot of places to turn to. There's not a lot of grief support out there, whether it's sudden loss, whether it's you know, some other sort of loss that was not sudden like ours was, but quite frankly, for that demographic, I don't know of any other real support groups out there. So again, we're going to be starting that up as part of our partnership. There will be a couple of 8-week sessions, one in the north suburbs, one in the northwest suburbs, and we'll build on that. And we'll see what the needs of the community are, and we will continue to build. We will continue to grow. We will continue to respond to what we really see out there as you know, what's going to help people, what's going to help the most amount of people that we can. So without taking up any more time, I'm going to turn it over, Elizabeth, back to you, I guess, and thank you all for attending.
So I want to express my appreciation to Scott and the Foundation because they also supported a couple of programs that he mentioned this morning. We did 2 other programs with Dr. Doka. Dr. Doka has an extremely long day, but he's up for the challenge. This morning we spoke to the Chicago Rabbinical Council. We had 30 rabbis, and he talked about the Board of Rabbis. He talked about Rabbi's Counselor. And then in the afternoon we had a program called Spiritual Care and Psychotherapy, Who Does What? And we had a whole bunch of clergy and mental health professionals talking about how to work together to help people in times of difficulty. So this would not be possible without the help of the Bauer Foundation. I cannot say it enough. So before introducing the speaker, I would like to make sure to invite you after the speaker for a reception and book signing in the area outside. We are so happy to have Women and Children's First, the bookseller, here to sell books for both professionals and the bereaved. And we also encourage you to visit the booths that are out there. We have a booth for the Bauer Foundation. We have one for our partner, CJE Senior Life, and also for JFCS, Jewish Healing Network. And lastly, for those of you who are looking for a continuing education credit this evening, please hand in your evaluation and they will give you the credit. And the last housekeeping detail is restrooms are in the hall. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Dr. Kenneth Doka is an internationally known expert on end-of-life and grief. He is a professor of gerontology at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle and senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. He's a prolific author. Dr. Doka has published 35 books and 100 articles and book chapters. And he is editor of both Omega, which is the Journal of Death and Dying, and Journeys, a newsletter to help in bereavement. Dr. Doka was elected president of the Association of Death Education and Counseling in 1993. The association also presented him with an award for outstanding contribution in the field of death education. He was also awarded outstanding contribution in thanatology and hospice, and his alma mater, Concordia College, presented him with their very first Distinguished Alumni Award. He has keynoted lectures throughout North America, Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, we mentioned at dinner tonight. He participates in the annual Hospice Foundation of America teleconference, and he has appeared on CNN and Nightline. And in addition, he has served as a consultant to medical, nursing, funeral, hospice, business, education, and social service agencies. And Dr. Doka is an ordained Lutheran minister. So please welcome Dr. Kenneth Doka.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My son has a much shorter, I mentioned earlier, my son has a much shorter introduction. When he heard an introduction very similar to that once, he simply said, "Dad, that translates as you have no life." So I guess we can a number of different ways. I'm Really honored to be here today, and I want to thank the Bauer Foundation and the Jewish Healing Network for bringing me out to Chicago. I much appreciate the time I've spent. You work me very hard, but it's been a fun time to spend with you. And I just want to say a few things sort of to set the ground rules for tonight, to give you a sense of what's going on. I'm really amazed that so many of you have come out tonight, and I think that's such a, so important, and I really want to thank you for coming out. I'm going to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, maybe an hour. I'll try to keep, once I get started, as you can see, it's hard for me to stop, but I'll do my best. But I look at that as being sort of the first part of the program. And the second part of the program is there's a reception out there. And after I finish my formal remarks here, I'll open up for any questions. But then I'll be out there and in here with you, and I promise to be sort of the last man standing tonight. And what I mean by that is if anybody wants to come up to me and chat with me for, ask a question privately, I would be happy to be here. My hotel is just 2 flights up on the second floor, so I'm not wandering too far. And the way I look at it is I'm all dressed up with no place to go. So, so if I can be of assistance, if I can be of help tonight, please let me know. And of course, and I'm going to be pointing to the people in this room, so you're not off the hook, who can be local resources. All of you have a kind of PowerPoint outline of my presentation, and I'll sort of roughly follow that, but at least it gives you something to take home, and as I said, to talk about. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about what we're going to try to do today. I have a sense of who you are. I mean, you have a sense of who I am by that wonderful introduction, but I don't necessarily have a sense of who you are. And I've noticed in lectures like this, when I've done these community lectures, people are often here for 3 different reasons. And let me get a sense of what brought you here tonight as an audience, as a people. And one of the reasons is that you're struggling with your own grief, that there may be some of you here, maybe many of you here, who are really here in the midst of your own loss. And your primary reason is to say, I wonder if there's something that might be said that will help me as I struggle with my own journey with grief. How many of you are in that category, that you're really here? Okay. And then there's a second group of people here who may be what I call the good friends of those, who said, there's a good, there's a lecture, maybe you should go to it, and I'll come with you, and I'll accompany you, and I'll drive you, I'll be with you, I'll support you. The good friends of those people. Maybe I'll buy you dinner. I may have just thrown in dinner, but or take you for a cup of coffee. How many of you are in that category of what I would call sort of the friend, the companion here tonight? Your primary reason is to support somebody else. Okay, a few of you raised your hands for that. And then, of course, the other group might be professionals who are here out of professional interest, out of professional responsibility, to say, well, what can I learn about sudden loss, and that to add to my toolkit to help others. And so, how many of you are here primarily in a professional role? Okay, so a kind of even split between the first and the third, and a couple of the seconds thrown in. Well, for those of you who are here for personal reasons, I think the next question is what can we deliver? What can you expect, and what can you not expect? What aren't we able to deliver tonight? And I used to always say to people, there's no magic wand in grief. And there's nothing that I can say tonight that can take away the pain and the loss that you have. I don't have that kind of magic wand. I'm a little cautious about saying that because I used to say it to one of my clients in therapy all the time. I don't have a magic wand. I can't take away your pain. I can't take away your grief. And after about a year, when we terminated therapy, he presented me with a gift, and I opened up the gift, and it was a magic wand. He says, you can't say that anymore. But much as I appreciated this glittery little magic wand with sort of glitter in this fluid, it really doesn't seem to work that well. And I'm reminded of that because the first time I ever did what I would call a community lecture, I had an interesting and almost unforgettable experience. And I was talking about grief, what helps when it hurts. And it was a lecture that was set up by a funeral home. And I was very nervous, to be quite honest with you, because I had spoken to classes and I was starting to make professional presentations to other professionals and had shared research papers at professional conferences. I had never really done a community lecture before on grief, so I didn't quite know what to expect. I wasn't 100% sure of how I approached this group, and I was very anxious at the end. They asked everybody to do an evaluation. What was the strength of the program, what was the weakness of the program. And after everyone left and all the evaluations were collected, I looked over them, and there's one that I've never forgotten. And it said, what was the weakness of the program? And the woman wrote on it, it didn't bring my husband back. And I thought of that, and I've never forgotten that, because I thought that was such a powerful message and such an important thing to take with me whenever I do these presentations. The real limits of what we can do. The only way I can take away the pain that some of you have is to restore that loss. And obviously, that's not in my power, it's not in anybody's power. But that doesn't mean, that you came for naught tonight, so to speak. Because there's two other stories I want to share with you that really say something about what you can expect, what you can bring, what you can hope for. And one of them was one of my favorite students, a student by the name, I'll call her Mary Ellen. And Mary Ellen was one of these wonderful, wonderful students that every graduate professor loves. Because she was always very interested. Whenever I had office hours on Monday, right before I taught the class, I could always count on her signing up on the sign-up sheet and coming in and being very interested in something she had read. She always would sign up and say, I read this and I want to talk with you about this. And she's one of those students you love to have, just vitally interested in the class. And about 3 months after the class ended, I don't think the class died. I think it was a fairly successful ending. But 3 months after the class ended, her brother died. Younger brother died in a car crash. And I went to the funeral to pay my respects. And soon after that, she came back, and she was back in graduate school, and she stopped in my office, and she said, I want to share something with you. She said, when I was taking your course on grief counseling, I was talking about it not just with you, but with all of my friends. I was probably boring them to death, because I constantly said, what I learned, and what I discovered, and what I read. And she said at the funeral of my brother, during the wake, she said, one of the people came up to me and said, did the course help? You took that course in grief counseling. Did it help? And she said, I thought about that. And she said, I wanted to tell you my answer. And her answer, I think, was both very profound and very wise. She said, it didn't make it any easier. She said, but it made it more understandable. I still went through the process of grief. I still struggled with some of the same things. It didn't make it any easier. I went through that whole roller coaster we're going to talk about. Those ups and those downs, those highs and those lows, that very, very difficult journey. But at least I kind of wasn't waylaid on it. I kind of knew what to expect. And the same message I got from another student, who was, in my mind at least, very, very different from Mary Ellen. And in the end turned out to be not so different, but in the beginning struck me as very different. When I first started teaching graduate school, I was 33 years old, and many of my students were older than I was. So it was a little bit of a kind of interesting process. And Stanley was, in those days, way older than I was. He was in his 50s, and I thought, wow, here's a guy in his 50s who's starting a new academic career, And, you know, and Stanley, unlike Mary Ellen, wouldn't really say much in class. And he kind of sat in the back. And I knew he had a career as a successful businessman. I don't know why I didn't know at the time why he stopped that career. But, you know, but he would just kind of sit in the back and kind of look at you. And I had this whole image of Stanley that turned out to be very wrong, but it was still the image I was working under at the time. And my image was that, you know, that Stanley was about 20 years my senior. In those days, I thought he was very old. Now I think he's quite young. And it's funny how your perspective changes. But Stanley was in his 50s, and I thought he was kind of looking at me saying, what's this young guy going to teach me? You know, he hasn't really lived life. I've lived life. He almost had this kind of, you know, this kind of constant look that I sort of saw as sort of cynical and dismissive. And then one day we were talking about the grief of widows and widowers. And I was talking about grief, and I was going to say some of the things I'm going to say tonight. And I said, you know, there's no timetable to grief. You know, there's no, like, 1 year and it's over, 6 months and it's over. And all of a sudden, for the first time, Stanley's hand, you know, shot up. And he stood up and he said to me, in almost a voice that I saw kind of as challenging, he said, are you saying it takes longer than a year to get through a loss? And I said, yeah, there's a lot of research, you know, there's a lot of support that says there's no timetable to grief. And I always tell my students, you know, if there's anything I say and you feel a need to challenge me, that's your right as a student, right? But when it happens, you're not always thrilled, you know. So Stanley, you know, so Stanley said, do you have proof of that? And I was taken back by that, and, you know, but I was on sound empirical ground. I knew there were a lot of studies. I knew I could get my hands on them quickly. And I said kind of almost dismissively, of course I do. And he said, can I have them on Thursday? Because our class met in the summer on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I said, meet me in my office at 2 o'clock. You know, now I don't think I'd say that. Now I think I'd say, no, Stanley, I'll tell you where they are. Your job is to find them. But I'm glad I didn't in that case. I'm glad it worked out the way it did. So, you know, so the next day I was, you know, I had a folder this thick with studies that I made copies of them. And I was going to show him I knew what I talked about. I may be 33 years old, but I know what I'm talking about. And here's the evidence to really prove it, you know? So Stanley came in. He said, do you have those studies? And I almost dismissively handed him this manila folder and said, yeah, there they are. Go read them. And then I was walking down. My office was in the library, and I saw Stanley making multiple copies of some of these studies. So I kind of walked over to him with a copy machine. I said, you know, because you know how you always think it's you, that everything's about you? And I thought, is he, you know, doing some kind of complaint, or is he creating some kind of issue? And I said to him, Stanley, is everything okay? And he said, you know, he said, hey, Doc, he said, you're probably wondering what's going on, huh? No. I said, a little bit, you know. He said, well, you know I don't share much in class. He said, you know, a lot of these students, I've been out of college for over 30 years, and I'm a little bit intimidated in the class, which I thought was interesting because, you know, again, how our perceptions are. You know, I was a little bit intimidated by him, and he was intimidated by everybody else in the group. And he said, but the reason I went on to graduate school is, he said, you know, since my 20s, he said, I ran a women's clothing store with my wife. We were very successful. He said, and she died, and after a very, very brief illness. And she said, when she died, I just didn't find that a joyful thing to do anymore. I loved working with her. I loved working at her side. And it hurt me just every day. So he said, I sold the business. He said, I did well. He said, I've always wanted to go to school. I've always wanted to study gerontology. And so I've been doing that. He said, and my friends have been wonderfully supportive. He said they've really been really great. They've been very supportive, and they've constantly had me for dinner and constantly had me around. And he said and he said, but I noticed something. We just had the anniversary of my wife's death. And he said after the anniversary, they'd still invite me for dinner. But, I always noticed that I was being seated next to a single woman. And, and they were always trying to sort of set me up and have me meet somebody. And he kept, and he said, I just couldn't function with these women. I wasn't really interested in a new relationship at this point in time. He said, and I began to say that to them, and they began to say, well, Stanley, it's time now. It's been a year. Your wife wouldn't want you to be single. It's time for you to get involved again. It's time, you're a good man. You make a healthy living. You're a good match. And he said, it's time to get married again. He said, and I just wasn't there. And my friends kept saying to me, there's something wrong with you, Stanley. You ought to talk to somebody. You're grieving too long. You're grieving too hard. And he said, I believe them. He said, when you said that in class the other day, it was like a cloud lifting. It was like a burden taken from my shoulders. He said, for the first time, I looked at myself and I said, Stanley, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just grieving. He said, and what I'm doing is, he said, I'm making a packet of these articles and sending them to all my friends. And I thought, what a great gift. That we can do that with Stanley. That Stanley can do that with what we said. So I think we can offer three things here. And I think the first thing we can offer is a validation. It is a sense that, that yes, many of you here are grieving. And very often, when I'm asked questions in sessions like this, the question always translates. It always comes down to, am I going crazy? I felt better the first 3 months than I felt after that. Is there something wrong with me? It's been a year, and I'm still not ready to I'm still not over this yet. Is there something wrong with me? And it's always this question. I think one of the things you'll come out with tonight is that is that we're just grieving, and we're not going crazy. And we're dealing with the normal and difficult emotions of loss, particularly when loss is complicated by suddenness. That's part of this very difficult, journey of grief. I think there's a second thing we can do tonight. And I think, but I think we have to do it carefully. And I think what we can do is maybe offer you suggestions for how to journey. But here's the careful part of this. As we talk about this tonight, you always have to look at it under a very individual prism. You always have to look at it in the sense of, does this sound right for me? Because the first thing we're going to stress about grief is that grief is an incredibly individual process. One of my mentors is a good friend of Rabbi Rob Roman, and Rabbi Rob Roman, one of the things he taught me, one of the things he loves to say, and it's so true, is that grief is as individual as snowflakes, as fingerprints. It's very unique. It's very individual. We all grieve in different ways. So when I say, here's a way to cope, or here's a way somebody coped, the thing that you have to say is, okay, does that make sense for me? Is that, or is there another strategy, another thing that I could use? One of my favorite stories about that is every year I offer in my community a lecture on how to handle the holidays. As a matter of fact, I'm booked for that next Tuesday. So thankfully there's not a storm coming in the horizon, and chances are I'll get home tomorrow, and chances are I'll give that lecture on Tuesday. And I always tell this one story about how to handle the holidays, where one of the first lectures I gave on that, it was right around the same time, right as we were approaching Thanksgiving. And one of the women, after I finished my lecture, said, I'm facing the first Thanksgiving without my husband. And I just have this image. And this image is that I see my husband, as he has been every year since we married, sitting at the head of the table, slicing the turkey. And she says, and I just can't think of, and I just can't get my head around, who's going to sit in that chair. So I turned to the group, And I said, many of you have lived through a Thanksgiving or a significant holiday in whatever your tradition, whatever your culture is. And I said, and you've all dealt, many of you have dealt with that empty chair. And how have you dealt with it? I got a lot of answers. Some people said, I couldn't deal with the empty chair. We went to a restaurant this year. We ate at my daughter's house. We did things differently. We had a buffet. Another group of people said, well, we kept the chair empty because it was a symbol that somebody who was important to us wasn't there that year. And another person said, it's funny, we kept the chair empty too, but we looked at the person as being symbolically there. And then another person said, well, in my culture, the eldest son sat there. And in my culture, the eldest daughter, the eldest child, my daughter, sat there. And one woman said, I'm head of the family now, I sat there. What's the best answer? There aren't any. All. Whatever works for you. And one of my clients always told me that she, that as she heard that story, she said, you know what we did? She said, I was worried about that too before you spoke about that in the lecture. And she said, my husband was a great sports person. And, and that's what we did every Thanksgiving. As soon, he couldn't wait for the turkey to get finished so the games could come on. And what we do is, she says, we have a race between the grandchildren. We call it Poppy's Race. And whoever wins Poppy's Race gets to sit in the chair that holiday. See, she heard that story exactly the way it should have been heard. It's not that I have a limited number of choices. It's that there are different ways to cope. And I have to find a way that works for me. We all have to find a way to deal with an empty chair. And there's no one way to do it. So, as we talk tonight about what might work and what might help, you have to listen to this and you have to say, let me do it my own way. And then I think finally, we have the hope that comes with shared stories. That no matter what our loss is, all of us find ways to deal with it. Well, I told you there wasn't a magic answer, but I am going to start with one. And I can tell you tonight how to avoid grief. How many of you would never like to have the feeling that you're having now, would never like to experience the intensity of grief that you're experiencing now? A lot of us would raise our hands, right? Well, I've got the answer for you. And the answer is never get attached to anything. Never get connected to anything. If you don't care about anything, you will never grieve again. How many of you want to take my offer? The truth is that grief is the price we pay for love. Grief is the cost of attachment. And if you want to avoid grief, just avoid any attachment. So what is grief then? Well, grief is a reaction to loss. And I think probably many of you are here tonight because you've had a significant loss, probably a loss by death, and probably a significant portion of you are here because maybe that loss was in fact sudden. And we'll address the different situations and different circumstances of sudden loss in a minute. But grief is a reaction to any kind of loss. So it doesn't have to be death. And that's important because sometimes we can look back on how we dealt with losses in our past and learn from them and get strength from them and grow from them. And it may be a loss that you had with a significant separation. It may have had a loss that you had because you once got a divorce. It may be a sense of loss that you had because you had to pick up and move maybe from one country to another or one section of the region to the other. Now, those of you who were in the morning session, you can't answer this question. That's unfair. But Sigmund Freud would always start his articles with a case study. And he wrote in almost 100 years ago an article about grief, really one of the formative articles about grief. And he started with a case study. Anybody know what his case study on grief was? Anybody want to guess what he looked at as a case study on grief? A grieving parent.
Yeah, I was going to say loss of parent, mother, father.
Yeah, that'd be a good guess, right? Loss of a child, loss of a spouse. It was a bride abandoned at the altar. And I think Freud was really trying to remind us something. And I think what he was trying to remind us of very wisely was that grief is about loss. And the second thing I think we need to remember is that grief is a highly individual kind of thing. We each grieve in our own way. Because first of all, the relationship with the person we lost was different. It was different in type, right? Some of you may have lost children. Some of you may have lost spouses. Some of you may have lost parents. Some of you may be here because you've lost good friends, people you cared about. Whatever that loss is. And those relationships are different. And it's different. Earl Broman used to say that when you lose a spouse, you lose your present. When you lose a child, you lose the future. When you lose a parent, you lose part of your past. And I think there's a wisdom to that. But I also think, to an extent, it's not entirely true. Because the truth is, any relationship alters your past, present, and future. Any significant loss affects all of those. And then not only is there the type of relationship, but there's the nature of the relationship. How strong was it? How interdependent were we? And a big one is how ambivalent was our relationship. Ambivalence refers to mixed feelings. How many of you know people who are married and you kind of say, I don't understand that couple. They can't live with the person, they can't live without the person, right? We all have ambivalent relationships in our life. I adore my son. I have a wonderful relationship with my son. My son is 40 years old. I think my son looks at himself as having a good relationship with me. One of the things of all the awards and honors I've gotten, the best one to me is that my grandson is named after me. And that's just kind of neat to me. When my grandson was a little bit younger, he once said to me, "Why weren't you named John? I like the name John." He was stuck with Kenny. So now he's good with Kenny. But when my son was 13 to 15, you know what I used to say about my son? I used to say, I love my son dearly, I just don't like him. And I know a lot about child development. I know what went on there. Aliens abducted my son the first day of second, put in a clone, and returned him 2 years later. I understand that. It's the only rational explanation. And my son, I think, has the same kind of reaction to me. A number of years later, he presented me for my birthday with a cup with that great comment from Mark Twain. Do you all know that great comment from Mark Twain? Mark Twain said, when I left home at 15, my father was the dumbest man on the face of the earth. When I came back 5 years later, I was amazed how much he had learned. So we have those ambivalent relationships in our life. And the truth about grief is that the more ambivalent the relationship, the more complicated and difficult the grief is. So it's often that relationship where you can't live with the person, you can't live without the person. That's the toughest kind of relationship to deal with, because you look back and you say, I wish I would have, and there's so much unfinished business and so much stuff that goes on. That's why it's so hard when teenagers lose parents, because often that much like my son, that's a very ambivalent time in relationships, or when parents lose teenagers, because there's so much unfinished pieces there. So again, the relationship, the circumstances of the loss. We're going to talk about sudden loss in a few minutes and really focus on sudden loss. And one of the things I never want to say is that sudden loss is harder. It is different. Each situation of loss. There's no good way to lose somebody, is there? You know, we often say, you know, sudden loss is easy on the person who died, harder on survivors, you know, chronic illness. The truth is they're all hard. And again, Earl has a wonderful comment. He says the worst loss is the one you're dealing with. You know, there's a great truth to that. The worst loss is the one you're dealing with. You know, our grief is going to be affected by the kind of support we get, you know, the support we get from internally, from ourselves, from our own strength, from our own spirituality, the support we get from the people around us. It's going to be affected by our health. It's going to be affected by our culture, by our spirituality. So everyone's going to have a grief reaction that's different. And it's going to affect us in different ways. It affects us physically. How many of you, when you experience grief, experienced it at a deeply physical level? I mean, you felt sick, right? Can I ask some of you what you felt? Chest pains.
Down in my gut.
Yeah, that's where I get it. Down in my gut. My stomach is all turned and you know and like other ones. Yeah.
My father had his legs amputated shortly before he died, and then I suddenly developed these tremendous pains in my legs. Right afterwards.
Yeah, pains in the leg, you know. And that's really interesting because I'm going to tell you some of the research that Jane Nichols did. Jane Nichols was a phenomenal woman. Do you remember in the 70s how we mishandled miscarriages? You know, there was no support if you had a miscarriage. There was no support if you had a stillbirth. Those perinatal losses were basically ignored. Any counseling was you're young, you're healthy, go get pregnant again. You know, there was no appreciation of the loss and the grief that people experienced. And Jane Nichols, who herself had had a series of miscarriages before she successfully brought two babies to term and had her son and her daughter, you know, was one of the people who changed the culture on that. And one of the articles she did, because remember at that point in time, physicians weren't taking her seriously. And they weren't talking about grief. And she tells the story of, she was the wife of the funeral director. So she was very, very concerned about ritual. And when one of her children was stillborn, she said, I'd like to have the body because I'd like to bury the child. And the physician looked shocked at her and said, and this is what he said, you know, and again, forgive me, I hate to even say what he said. He said, we already disposed of the medical waste. He said, so they couldn't give her the body back. But what they did give her was a psychiatric consultation because they thought the request was so unusual. Jane looked at that and said, I wonder if in fact I experienced that or other people. You know, or I wonder in fact if my request is unusual or if other women who experience miscarriages have similar kinds of reactions. And Jane, who had finished college but had no research training, said, well, I'm going to do some research. And if I'm going to do research, it has to be good research. And it has to be credible research. And it has to appear in journals. And it has to, you know, it has to be something that these physicians are going to read. So, you know, so that I can reach them, I can understand, you know, that they can understand this. And so she started doing, and so she did that research, and she had it published in a medical journal. And she went back to Children's Hospital in Akron, Ohio, and said, here's proof that you do not do this well. And she says, so the first thing you have to do is hire me to train your staff and support your parents. She spent 30 years before she retired from Children's Hospital, heading the bereavement programs. But her research was fascinating, because remember, in this era, when perinatal loss was not recognized, when perinatal loss was not acknowledged, these women couldn't say, I feel grief. So what they did is they talked about their physical symptoms. And where do you think these women experienced pain, complained of pain? Yeah, uterus, womb. Number 3. Breast and heart, number 2. What?
Arms.
Exactly. Upper arms. And it makes sense when you hear the name of her article, The Empty Arm Syndrome in Women Who Have Experienced Perinatal Loss. You sound like you read that article. You have, huh? Yeah, very, very powerful. That symbolic pain that you've experienced, that you just described. There's incredible kinds of ways that people respond to loss, very, very physically. I always use a very quick example with my class. How many of you ever went to sleepaway camp as a kid? How many of you ever worked at a sleepaway camp when you were like in college, or whenever? Okay. Who saw the homesick kids first? The nurse. The nurse, and they weren't coming to the nurse and saying, I'm homesick. They were coming to the nurse and saying, my stomach hurts, my head hurts, my legs hurt, my arm hurts. But what they were really dealing with was grief. So we do experience grief on a very, very physical level. And often in the shock of sudden loss, that's one of our major reactions. We experience grief emotionally, right? And what are some of the emotions we associate with loss? Crying and sadness. Guilt. Guilt's a big one. Yeah. Guilt. And that's so true. Margaret Miles and Alice Deming, two nurse researchers, said people who experience grief often experience 6 different types of guilt. They feel, what she called causation guilt. I caused this. And it doesn't have to be rational to be real. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to make sense. I should have made him stop smoking. I shouldn't have let him go to the store. Whatever it is. I should have been there. I should have recognized that she was having trouble breathing. Whatever those are. Another kind of guilt is moral guilt. This is a punishment for something I've done. Another kind of guilt is what we call role guilt. I should have been a better. And you can fill it. I should have been a better mother, father, sister, brother, friend. Then there's survivor guilt. I feel guilty because I'm alive and they're not. Siblings often experience that. Older people often experience that when younger people die. And then we can experience what we call grief guilt. I feel bad because I feel bad. I feel guilty because I should be doing better. And then we can experience recovery guilt. I feel bad because I feel good. I shouldn't be having a good time. I shouldn't be experiencing this. So again, guilt. What are some other emotions? Anger, yeah. You know what the term bereaved actually comes from? It comes from a Latin root that means to have something ripped away by force. I'm old enough to remember the 70s. Some of you remember the 70s? Okay. But you remember what the expression to be ripped off? It got ripped me off. That's what bereavement means, to be ripped off. And think about that anger. Can I ask your name now? Patty. Patty's bag is right here. Suppose all of a sudden that I dropped this microphone, grabbed your bag, and ran out. Okay. What would be your reaction?
Chase you.
Panic and run after you.
Yeah, panic, anger, right? Let's just pretend I'm faster. You don't catch me. So you're angry at me, right? But who you're going to get angry at? I'm not here anymore. I can't be a target to your anger. Yeah, maybe that's guilt. So you're going to be angry at yourself, which is, guilt. I left it there. You might also be angry at poor Elizabeth. Because you might have said, Elizabeth, when you gave that great introduction, you could have said, but keep your bags in your hands, because here's this issue. I know. When I say this, I sometimes see people subtly move it during the lecture. Yeah, but we do that in grief, and often we get angry. We're angry at the person who died. We're angry at God, maybe. We're angry at ourselves. But then sometimes that anger just gets dissipated to everybody else around us. And that has a kind of negative effect because people start isolating us. Because who wants to be around an angry person? So then we even get angry about being isolated. So it creates this destructive cycle. And we can experience all kinds of emotions. Another one we often don't talk about is jealousy. How come my wife's not here and yours is? That's a hard one to identify and talk about. I always say there's one commandment dealing with stealing, there's one commandment dealing with adultery, one commandment for murder, but we need two about jealousy. I think there's a reality to that. And sometimes we may have, we may have a range of emotions, and we go up and down. And then grief affects the ways we think. How many of you find it hard to concentrate following the loss? How many of you find it hard to focus? One of the things I always tell teachers is that sometimes the cognitive manifestations of grief can mimic learning disabilities. And so you always have to do a loss inventory. Grief affects the ways we behave. We lash out, we cry, and it also affects sometimes our spirituality. Sometimes we find our faith stronger. Sometimes we find ourselves alienated. We have all kinds of different feelings. So grief affects us in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of moments. And again, we may grieve in different ways. And some of my work with Terry Martin has been on what we call styles of grieving. And some people are more what we call intuitive in their grief. And what we mean by that is that when they grieve, they grieve more on an emotional level. They describe their grief as waves of affect, as waves of feeling. And they often find it helpful to sort out those feelings, to talk about those feelings. But on the other end are people who grieve more by doing. They may set up legacies to their spouse. They may, one of my classic stories is one of the people we interviewed for our studies on these grieving styles was a man whose daughter died in a car crash. Cold Maryland night, coming home late at night, a little bit late for curfew. 17-year-old, young woman, new driver, icy Maryland night. And as she turned the corner of her street, her car overturned and went through a neighbor's picket fence. And he said, he told us the day of her funeral, literally the day he buried her, he went out and he started fixing that fence. And the neighbor kept running out and saying, you don't have to do this, John. You don't have to do this. And he said, no, I do. And he said that was the only part of the crash that I could fix. And I needed to fix it. That was the most therapeutic thing that I did. So we grieve in different ways. And sometimes in a family, the different ways we grieve can be a source of problems. It can be a source of conflict. Because we might not understand, why aren't you crying? Why aren't you grieving the way I'm grieving? And I always like what one of my colleagues, Sarah J. Nichols, said. How we grieve is not a measure of our love. We just grieve in different ways. And sometimes we may wonder and we may worry because grief is kind of a roller coaster. Now you have to always be careful with metaphors, whenever you give a metaphor. And a roller coaster is one of my favorite metaphors of grief. Because grief is like that. It has its ups and its downs, its highs and its lows. But you have to be careful with metaphors because if I were working with you as an individual, I'd say, how many of you ever have ridden a roller coaster? Okay. You liked them when you were a kid? Yeah? Okay. Not today, but you liked them when you were a kid, right? And so with you, I'd say, well, grief is kind of a roller coaster. You're going to have those ups and those downs, those highs and those lows, those good days and those bad days. You're going to oscillate. You're going to move between some days feeling better and some days feeling worse. But if you turned to me and said, no, I always hated roller coasters, I was frightened from day one about them, I wouldn't turn to you and say, well, grief is very much like a roller coaster, because that would be a helpful metaphor to you. But again, what we need to see, the problem is we often have two theories of grief. First of all, we look at grief and we think it's going to be a predictable set of stages. First I'm going to experience this, and then I'm going to experience that, and then I'm going to experience that, or we think of it as kind of like what I call climbing the mountain. Each day I'm going to get a little bit further up. Each day I'm going to feel a little bit better. And each day I'm going to make a little bit more progress. Maybe slow, but each day it's going to be easier. And grief isn't like that. Grief is ups and downs. Grief is highs and lows. Grief is time we think we're doing better and times we're not doing well. And some of that is predictable. I mean, what are bad days? I mean, what are some most predictable bad days? Holidays, anniversaries, birthdays. And some just throw us, right? We just don't know what's going on. But for some reason, today is not a good day. And sometimes we can figure out why, and sometimes we can't. One of my students, my students do grief counseling, and one of my students was saying, she was meeting with a client one day, and this client had lost her mother. Her mother was very special to her. They had a great relationship. And she said, and the mother died very suddenly. She actually fell in a shower, which is ironic because of the story I'm going to tell you, and she cracked her head and she died. And she said, and so she was dealing with that, that grief of that sudden loss. And the first thing my student asked her is, how are you doing today? And she said, it's funny, Joyce. She said, when I woke up today, I was really on a high point in the roller coaster. And I got in the car, and all of a sudden I plunged. And my student was a little bit worried, and Joyce said to her, do you think it was because you were coming here? And she said, no, actually, I think that's why I woke up feeling good, because I always feel good when I see you. She said, I don't know what it was. And they spent the whole hour trying to figure out what had happened between the time she woke up and the time she got in the car. Why had she done this unpredictable plunge? Later that night, she got a call from her. When she got home, it was a message on her unit. She said, Joyce, I figured it out. It was lilacs. And the next time they met, she said, what about lilacs? And she laughed and she said, well, one of the things that used to drive me crazy about my mother is my mother used to go to this 5 and 10, and she used to buy these big bottles of this cheap lilac perfume. So I picture it in the bathroom. She had it in the bathroom. It was a bottle about this big. It was pale purple, and it had this strong odor of lilacs. And she said, whenever there was a birthday, she said I'd buy her a little bottle of this exquisite perfume, Chanel No. 5, Obsession, whatever the current brand of the du jour was. And she said, and the next time I'd smell that brand on her, and then the next time it'd be the damn lilacs. and she said, I realized that when I went out when I came back today, I noticed the smell of lilacs in the air. So without even consciously noting it, she smelled those lilacs. It brought her back to her relationship with her mother, and plunged her down in that roller coaster. And the roller coaster is a good analogy, because if you think about it, how many of you have ridden roller coasters? Is the beginning of the ride the worst part? No, not the beginning usually. Because you're going up, it's slow, it's your first time, you're saying, yeah, it's beautiful, great view, and then you hit that first downturn, and your stomach goes. And grief's like that. Very often we do better in the beginning than we do later on. Because in the beginning, we're still in a state of shock, especially with sudden loss. We're still in a state of shock. The second thing that happens in the beginning is that we're getting a lot of support. People are around us. People are calling us. People seem to care. And then we're busy. There's lots of work that needs to be done. You've got to send thank you notes. You've got to send acknowledgments. You got forms that have to be filled out and insurance that has to be processed. It's later, when all that's over, that we really make our first significant big plunge. Sometimes we may be worried that we're doing too well. And one of the patterns of grief is resilience. Some people, grief just doesn't affect them the way it affects other people. They have a comparatively limited reaction to loss. Part of it may be the situation. Maybe they've had a chance to say goodbye. Maybe their loss isn't so sudden. And maybe there are other factors too. They have a spirituality that supports them. They're optimistic. Whatever it is, we have to realize that everybody grieves differently. And there's no timetable to grief. There's no time that says 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, 14 months, it's over. For most people, what we experience is that over time, the roller coaster modulates. We still have our ups and downs. They're not as intense. They don't last as long. They don't come as frequently. Our pain lessens. We begin to function in ways similar to the ways we functioned before. Sometimes we may even grow in grief. We may learn new skills. We may learn new insights. We may develop new abilities. But we're always going to have surges of grief throughout our life. We never really get over it. That's why I always tell my students, bring closure to the term closure. There's always going to be those moments where you experience it. It may be a young girl whose father dies when she's 12 years old. And 15 years later, she's walking down the aisle. And she looks to her side, it's her uncle or her brother or her stepfather or her grandfather or her mother on her side. And she says, my dad should be here. And even in that moment, there's that surge of grief, and that's normal. And one of the things that I do with my clients is as we approach the end of therapy, I ask them to say, what are going to be some of those moments for you? What are going to be some of those times that you're going to experience those surges? Again, not that we're going to make it any easier, but simply that we're going to make it more predictable. We continue a bond with that person. And this is an important thing because sometimes people hold on to grief because they're fearful. If they lose that, if they lose the pain, they lose the connection. We always have that connection. People who are important to us stay in our memory. They're part of who we are. We have their legacies. For people who know me, this is my infamous color-coded list of things to do every day. First thing I do in the morning is make up my list of things to do and color-code it by time. Probably in about 15 minutes, I'll cross out session 3. My father kept a list. My son keeps a list. My grandson doesn't yet, but he likes colors. We're hopeful. We have these spiritual connections. So again, we have this continuing bond. Now, I want to say something, and it's very important that we talk about the particular issues in sudden loss. And there's an Asian proverb that I think of as I talk about this. And it's an Asian proverb that goes something to the effect of this. We are like all others, some others, no others. And I think that's very true in grief, and I think that's very true in sudden loss. There are some things about sudden loss that are just common to everyone who experiences it. Certain things that happen. Certain things that we take from it. But then each type of sudden loss creates its own issue. So if somebody dies of suicide, that's different from dying of a heart attack. It's different from dying from a homicide. It's different from dying from an accident. All of those have their own unique pieces. And then we never want to lose in this the individuality of grief that we've talked about earlier. So we are like all others, some others, no other. And some of the things that make sudden loss unique is it's kind of the dual challenge. The first thing that happens is we experience grief, obviously. But we also experience grief plus. And again, please know I'm not following the PowerPoint directly. I'm just talking about the points that are in that PowerPoint. Let me give you an example. See that big chandelier above you? Suppose all of a sudden tonight it fell. Okay. Not only am I going to have you hide your pocketbooks, but I'm going to have you start moving your seats. Okay. Let's say all of a sudden it fell. Now, and it fell on somebody, and horrifically it killed that person. What would happen to us in the audience? Well, the first thing we would do is for those of us who knew the person, we would grieve the loss of that person. We would grieve the loss of that person deeply. The second thing that, and all of us may vicariously grieve the loss of that person, even if we didn't know that person. And it's a horrible thing to do. But more than that, we each have a trauma. Because all of a sudden we realize that our assumptions of the world, our assumptions of safety, have now been deeply challenged. That's what sudden loss does. It challenges our sense of safety. And I guarantee you that you would never walk into a room like this again and not notice where the chandeliers were. And I can guarantee you that you would never sit directly under a chandelier for the rest of your life. You would always carry with you that sense of unsafety. And that's what makes sudden loss different. We deal with two problems simultaneously. We deal with grief, but we also deal with a second loss. And that second loss is the world becomes less safe. It is less benevolent. It is less fair. It is less predictable. When a person dies at 95 years old from a chronic illness, we grieve that person. We may grieve that person greatly. But we still, it sort of supports our sense of justice. You're born, you get old, you die. Doesn't mean we don't grieve that person. But when a sudden loss happens, it creates a whole other issue. It creates a whole second kind of loss. So we lose our assumptive world. We have grief and trauma. And because of the suddenness, we may have the sense of that there's unfinished business. There's something I wanted to do. There's something I yet needed to say. I never told the person I love them. Whatever that is. Another issue we have when loss is sudden is, if somebody dies of of bone cancer or something, we may think, or pancreatic cancer, there was little I could do to prevent it. But in most cases of sudden loss, there's always a lot of the what ifs. What if I were there? What if I didn't go there tonight? What if this happened? What if that happened? And that complicates our grief as well. So we always struggle with the issue of preventability and the issue of powerlessness. Something happened and I was powerless to change it. So those are all kind of common factors. Now, having said that, each situation brings with it its own particular factors. So, for instance, when a sudden loss is what we might call a natural sudden death, a heart attack, a stroke, an aneurysm, we always have to look at things. There may be the issue of preventability. Could I have done something if I were there? Did anybody know? There may be an issue of blame to the person. I had one person who was constantly saying, my wife was a real stoic. She died of an aneurysm. And he said, I always wondered if she had any headaches before that or any signs. She was not the person to talk about it. So there's that issue of was there something that person wasn't looking at? Was there some risk factors that person ignored or kept to themselves? And then the whole death situation. Was there anybody around to witness it? Did the person die alone? Did something happen that made it hard to help that person? With accidents, when somebody dies of an accident, there's the issue of culpability. Somebody did something. They may not have done something intentionally, but they did something. So how do we deal with that issue of culpability? And what makes it real hard is we have an adversarial legal system that makes it very, very difficult. A number of years ago, I was involved in a small car accident. I was coming home one night in Dutchess County, where I live in New York. It's in the Hudson Valley, and it's got these rolling hills. Anybody from Dutchess County? You know Dutchess County? Poughkeepsie or something? And as I came over one hill, it was about 10 o'clock at night, there were some teenagers who were sleigh riding. This was a busy highway, but they were sleigh riding because it was snowing, and they were teenagers. And I jammed on the brakes as I saw them in the way of the road, and my car just sideswipe somebody who had, minor injuries, but there was a lawsuit. And, and we went in for the first deposition, and I said, I really want to apologize to the person and say, I'm really sorry it happened. And the lawyer looked at me like I was insane and said, don't you, if you say anything, I will not represent you. I always felt bad about that. After it was over, I did have a chance to chat with them, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry this happened. But again, to him, that was admitting fault. That was admitting blame. And and later on, when the case was all settled, after the deposition, I had a chance where I said, can I talk to the family now? I said, now you can talk to the family. And they said it was so important. It was just so nice to hear from you and know that. And we felt bad for you because we realized she was stupid to be out there, and we told her that. But it was just nice to. That you came and you told us that. Homicide is really a tough one. Because, when somebody dies of homicide, now here's a nice thought to go home with tonight. Okay? You're 4 times more likely to be killed by somebody you know than by an absolute stranger. Right? Isn't that a pleasant thought? But think about what that really means. Is that it means that if that if you lost somebody because of a homicide, you probably lost 2 people. You probably lost victim and perpetrator. One of the most difficult grief cases I had was a 15-year-old boy whose father was abusive, not so much to the boy, but violent toward the mother. We'd get, and again, it was one of those, those cycles of violence where he would only get violent when he was drunk, but he was drunk a lot. And then he'd be sorry the next day, and everything would be forgiven, and everything would be forgotten. And one night, in the midst of one of his drunken rants, as he was hitting the mother, this 15-year-old boy stood up for his mother. He took a kitchen knife, and he said, leave her alone. And the guy literally got into his face. And he said, what, you think you're tough? Boom, boom. You think you're so tough? Go ahead, plunge it. Go ahead. You think you could do that? I don't think you have, the guts. He actually used another term. But, and the kid finally, in frustration, shoved the knife into his heart. He was never charged. The police looked at it as a case of self-defense. They had been called to this house numerous times. But I remember this counseling this boy who was dealing with the legacy of this, the terrible thing of. But I remember also talking and got the mother into another counselor because she was grieving 2 losses. She was grieving the loss of her husband, who she had a highly ambivalent relationship with, and she was also grieving the loss of innocence of her child. So that's what can make homicide so tough. And then there's the media. And the whole legal system, where often the victim is drawn in as much mud as the perpetrator. So again, each situation of sudden loss creates its own difficulty. And maybe the intrusive imagery that we have in any sudden loss. What happened? And what was this person thinking? What was happening as this person was doing it? Suicide creates its own factors. The complications, the conflict and ambivalence. The stigma, of suicide, the disenfranchisement of it. And again, the feelings of guilt and preventability. If only I got home earlier. If only I knew this person was so depressed. If only I dragged him to a psychologist. So we have all these different issues in each situation of loss. And I think it's important to recognize that, to acknowledge that, and in each of these situations. And again, in public tragedy, there are their own issues. That we're dealing. Think of New York, where 43 people died in the last week. The whole system is strained, and the like. So, what can we do, and what can help? And I think the first thing to realize is that we have no choice about grief, but we have choices within grief. There are things we can do as we struggle with grief. A number of years ago, I took my son caving. Any of you ever go caving? into caves, spelunking? Nobody ever said, oh, okay.
Not big caves.
Small caves. Okay.
Mammoth cave.
What?
Mammoth cave.
But you went in there in the wild section?
No.
Oh, just the commercial section. Okay. How about you, Joe?
Missouri's a cave.
Oh, Missouri's a cave
I
state.
met Denise for cave.
Okay. So, and I did the easiest kind of caving, which is called horizontal caving. Horizontal caving, you're crawling, you're slithering, you're crawling, you're walking, you're stooping. But caves are made by limestone, by water flowing through limestone. So they're wet and they're muddy, and I had taken him on this cave trip with me. He was about 11 years old, and we were walking in a stream of water about up to his chest at that time. He was muddy, he was dirty, and then we reached a section of the cave called the Pinch. And the Pinch is where it looks like the cave's ended, but it really hasn't. There's a passage about 2.5 feet that's about 2 feet underwater. So what you have to do is you have to join hands with your group, clasp wrists, duck under, go under this passage for about 3 feet, totally in the dark. And then you get to the other side of the cave and you can see the light on the other end. Joe's going to be setting up a trip to that cave, so if you want to see Joe later on, you can sign up for it. In any case, so we did this, and he was a little bit reluctant, he was a little bit scared, and I said, well, we can go back the way we came. We thought an hour and a half, we'll just do it. He said, let's just do it, Dad. Let's go with the rest of the group and do it. And when we got over it, he was really excited, and he was really feeling good about himself. And he said to me, this is one of those things you always talk about. And I didn't really know what he was talking about. And I said, what's that, Mike? And he said, you always said there are situations in life where you have to grow up or grow down. Grief is one of those situations. You're going to change. Significant loss is going to change you. It's going to change you significantly. You have no choice about that. The choice is whether you grow up or grow down. Catherine Sanders said that. Catherine Sanders said that ultimately what we need to do, and Catherine Sanders was herself a researcher in the field, but she was a grieving mother as well. She got into the field from her own loss and from her own grief. She had watched her 15-year-old son die in a water skiing accident. She looked from shore, and a boat hit the tow line. And what she said is that ultimately people in grief have 3 choices. They can, one choice is to die. Another choice is to just stay in this kind of painful period and live in grief. And a third choice is to reach a state of renewal. So how do we do that? And how do we make that choice? And Bill Warden talks about the tasks of grief. And he says whenever we deal with grief, we have to acknowledge the reality of the loss. And again, that's why funerals are so important, particularly in sudden loss. That's why the rituals around death are so important, because they give us a chance to finish business. They give us a chance to say our final goodbyes, to say things that we may have never had a chance to say. We need to find ways to express our feelings, to understand our reactions, and again, support groups can be so helpful there. If you're a support group kind of person, or somebody in our earlier session talked today about dancing through grief, using physical activity as a way to get through loss. So we need to experience our emotions. We need to adjust to life without a person. And here, when I work with people, I say, look at your strengths. What's helped you get through loss in the past? Whatever helped you get through loss in the past will help you now. What's been a problem? Because what's been a problem for you, you need to prepare for that. How can you use your support system well? And I always do a trick. It's a great technique, and I sort of challenge you to do it. If you're in the midst of grief here, and you have a support system, and most of us do, go home and write the names of everybody on that support system. Write down the names. Okay? You got a list of names now, people you can look for support. Your family, your friends, your faith community, all the people who matter to you. Okay, so you got this list? We're not finished. I want you to put a D next to everybody on that list who's a good doer. You know, you need something done, they'll do it. Okay? My neighbor's like that. Whenever I'm away, he takes in my mail. I don't have to remind him, you know. You just have to tell him I'm gone. And I know when I come home tomorrow morning, my mail is going to be in a plastic bag on my kitchen table. I'm counting. I don't have to remind him. He's a great doer. Put an L next to the people who are great listeners. You know, you can always call them at any time, and they'll listen. By the way, my neighbor's not a good listener. He doesn't get the R. Put an R next to people who are good respite people. What does that mean? Well, grief is hard work. And there, you know, and like any hard work, we need time away from it. And these are the people we go out to, we can enjoy a movie with, we can have a great dinner with, and they're never going to turn to us in the midst of it and say, Joe, how you really doing? Because they hope against hope we don't bring it up. But that's their gift. Their gift is that they give us time away from our grief. And when I do this, people say two things to me. They say, I realize, first of all, I never recognized the value of respite people. As a matter of fact, they were annoying me. Because they never asked. But that's their gift. And I was having my doers listen, and my listeners do, and I was getting frustrated because nothing was heard, and I wasn't getting anything done. You know, we can use our support system as well. We need to say, how are we going to remember the person? How are we going to continue the bond? Catherine Sanders said she always asks her clients 3 questions. What do I wish to take from my old life into my new life? What do I wish to leave behind? What do I need to add? We need to ask, how does our faith speak to us? And how can we use our faith's practices, the rituals, the beliefs, the community? How can they help us deal with our loss? You know, there's one good thing, and the Brower Foundation is a good example of that. There are resources developing and resources available now that didn't exist 30 years ago. You know, there are books on almost every kind of loss that you can buy, you know, from self-help bookstores and things like that. There are all kinds of resources that didn't exist. We don't have to grieve alone. There's counseling, there's self-help groups, there's support groups. There's just an increase in understanding. And again, with foundations like your foundation, Scott, that continue to build resources, that can be so important and so powerful. We may need to create rituals just to remember the person. Yeah. Just to say, this person is part of our, we have a ritual during the holidays that we use. We decorate a Christmas tree. And the first 3 ornaments we put on it are 3 ornaments to my parents and my godson's father. It's a way of saying we can talk about them during the holidays. You know, maybe we light a candle. It may be we do whatever we need. When I finish my grief group, I always raise one last issue with them. And I always say to them, okay, it's November 14th. Suppose I meet you. You know, we finished our last session. This is our last session. And next November 14th, all of a sudden, I see you in the supermarket. And I say, hey, I haven't seen you in a year. How are you doing? What are you going to tell me? It's always interesting because most people really, you know, it's a good way to assess where people are. And most people are very hopeful by the time they finish the support group. And they say things like, I'm doing a little bit better now. I'm in a better place in the roller coaster. You were right. The ups and the downs are less intense now. And that's my hope for you. I hope that a year from now, if you come back to this lecture, I probably won't be giving it next year, but if you come back to it, you're saying, I'm in a better place now. And I wish that for you as we go through this season. Thank you very much.